Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I pay tribute to the honourable member, my honourable friend for Enfield North, who was more than a super sub in her contribution for her friend and my friend, the member for Mitcham and Waldham, and we all wish her a very speedy recovery. And she gave some very good examples of people potentially losing out, despite the intention, I'm sure, of the introduction of the so-called national minimum wage, living wage, I beg your pardon, to increase pay for the low paid. We have had a lot of very good contributions. We had a contribution from the honourable member for Shipley, who appears to have read his book on microeconomics in terms of what the impact is of increasing wages, but didn't get onto the macroeconomics volume, and of course the impact of labour as a derived demand, and therefore the impact of higher wages potentially on aggregate demand in the economy, and therefore on the possibility, as happened actually with the introduction of the national minimum wage, that increasing pay for the less well-off because of their higher propensity to consume can in fact result in a more prosperous economy. I will give way.
I just wondered on what basis he felt more qualified than the Office of Budget Responsibility, who were very clear that 4 million hours would be lost, including 60,000 jobs.
Well, I will get on to my concerns about the way that this particular policy has been introduced in due course. But of course, there's plenty of evidence from the introduction of the national minimum wage that if you do it correctly, that increasing pay for the lowest paid workers can actually result in an increase in aggregate demand and greater productivity and prosperity for the economy. We also had contributions from the honourable member, my honourable friend for Bradford South, for Rochdale, for Burnley. We had a contribution from the honourable member for Lanark and Hamilton East, my honourable friend for Ellesmere Port and Neston, my honourable friend, the member for Halifax, whose reference to Adele and the importance of paying younger people sounded convincing to someone like me, I must say. We also had a contribution. We also had a contribution from the honourable gentleman, for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey, who told us of his experience as a council leader. We had contributions from my friend from Worsley and Eccles South, the honourable lady from Glasgow Central, my neighbour, the honourable lady, the member for Cardiff Central, who I thought made a very, very pertinent point about seafarers and the importance of remembering that they are actually exempt from this and the need to bring in new protections for seafarers, and also from the honourable lady for Hayward and Middleton, who told us about her partner who spent a lot of time at B&Q. As a result, no doubt, if it's anything like my household, I've been told you had to go to B&Q and do certain DIY jobs, so much so that in years gone by we used to call it be in the queue, because I was down there so much. And then we had the contribution from the honourable lady for the front bench for the SNP. Now, today's debate, it's been a rather peculiar debate, because actually I think there's been a lot of, on this side, general support for the idea behind the so-called national living wage that the Chancellor announced in his budget, but a lot of criticism at its implementation and the potential for it actually to make some people worse off as a result of its implementation, and that's the purpose of today's debate. Now, it's been highlighted already that in fact, the only contribution, when I think about it, from the backbenches opposite seemed to be against the government's policy altogether. So it has been a peculiar debate in that respect. Now, as has been highlighted, the Labour government introduced the national minimum wage back in 1998. It was opposed tooth and nail, as we know, by the Conservative Party at the time. The minister who's in his place, I think, has previously and rather generously acknowledged that just like other progressive achievements of Labour governments, for example the National Health Service, despite the tooth and nail opposition of his party, that they were wrong to actually oppose the national minimum wage, and he said that on the record in my presence in this House, and I'm grateful for his generosity in doing so. Now, I said so-called national living wage because, as has been pointed out many times during the course of today's debate, this really wasn't at all an introduction of a new concept. It's just a symptom of the Chancellor's inability to do anything that might be worthwhile without trying to extract the maximum political advantage out of it, as highlighted by the former Work and Pensions Secretary when he applied and when he resigned, and said that the Chancellor was always seeking to do something highly political rather than necessarily in the national interest. The Chancellor could have said, I want to increase the national minimum wage for the over 25s, which is in effect what this policy is. Instead, he chose to pinch the name living wage from those who've worked on it and devised it, who calculated it, who come together and brought together the evidence based on need for the concept of a living wage and have campaigned for it right across the country with great success. He nicked that name for his own policy, which is not, as we all know and has been pointed out in the debate, a true living wage, based on the concept of evidence of need as was developed by the Living Wage Foundation. Now, similarly, he could have done the thorough preparation a policy like this requires and put it through a proper stress test, as was done by Ian McCartney and others when the national minimum wage was first introduced. But that would have spoilt his piece of political theatre in the budget. The great Osborne could not have pulled out a rabbit from his hat to the delight of all the misdirected audience on the green benches opposite. So the problems we're debating today of some workers potentially being worse off could have been avoided if we had a Chancellor more interested in the substance of making policy work rather than the smoke and mirrors of political presentation. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's illegal for employers to pay less than the national minimum wage, yet figures provided by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills show that the numbers that have been fined for paying below the national minimum wage have actually increased in recent years. We'd like to know what measures will be in place to ensure that we don't have a repeat of this deliberate law breaking and undermining when the so-called national living wage is more established. Will these companies be named and shamed? Will there be financial penalties involved?
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will, very briefly.
Just briefly, I just wondered if my honourable friend was aware of the case of My Home Care, the subsidiary of Mighty in the care sector, who's had to make a significant number of payments to workers in Wales, has had to make out-of-court settlements for non-payment of the minimum wage, and yet it was the Conservatives opposite who appointed its chief executive, Mighty, Barrister McGregor-Smith, to a peerage at the same time.
I am aware of that case, and my other neighbour also reflects very accurately the problems in the care sector which came up during the course of the debate today, and also the connections perhaps in some of these companies that need to be looked into more carefully. Now, there are actions that are being taken by some employers which may not be illegal also, but undermine the spirit of the law to provide an increase in wages and living standards for British workers. And that's also been highlighted in the debate. Some of those who are pursuing this curmudgeonly path, Madam Deputy Speaker, are in the sectors which might benefit most from workers having extra purchasing power in their pocket, for example, tourism, retail and hospitality. And the Low Pay Commission has also warned that some employers could label employees apprentices, as we heard during the course of the debate, to avoid having to pay the so-called national living wage. Now, we've heard examples of various supermarket chains, retailers. We've heard examples of restaurants and so on. I'm not going to name them or repeat what's been said during the course of the debate in the interest of time, but just to observe that in a week when we've seen efforts of one loss-making chief executive officer trying to secure a pay package of £14 million a year, it is really obscene that an ultimate pay rate of £9 by 2020 is being undermined by the heads of some of these big businesses. Corporation tax has been reduced in recognition of the introduction of the so-called national living wage. There have been savings to businesses according to that. Can a minister say if that is intended to compensate businesses for the phased introduction of the national living wage, so-called, and if so, does he condemn businesses who are carrying out some of these practices? Private sector businesses may have other opportunities to recuperate the increased costs in terms of raising their prices for their goods and services or altering the way labour, capital and profits are apportioned and rewarded. But these are not choices available to local government, as has been pointed out also in our debate, and there's a huge gap there. Will the Minister agree to review the cuts to local government in view of the impact of the national living wage? And we also heard about the issue of young people. Many honourable members introduced that topic quite rightly, and the young people have been deliberately excluded from the so-called national living wage. We had one example in The Guardian recently of a case of a worker at a well-known DIY store, if I put it more strongly than that, who was on £7.20 before the introduction of the national living wage, so-called, and £6.70 after its introduction. And he said, and I quote, "I'm getting less for doing the same job. I feel so worthless." So what's the Minister's reaction to that? And what assessment has he made of the impact of the so-called national living wage on workers below 25? And what's the purpose, we heard this during the course of the debate, of widening the differential between workers under 25 and those 25 or over? What is the purpose of that? Is it to increase demand for the under 25s, or is it to reflect somehow or other that he believes under 25s are worth less in productivity terms than those over the age of 25? What is it for, that particular widening of that differential? Now, I'll close by saying this, Madam Deputy Speaker. The so-called national living wage is something which could be celebrated on all sides of the House if introduced properly and if the letter and spirit of the law are upheld in its introduction. If not, as we've heard, it could end up with many workers considerably worse off. On this side, we'll be watching very closely to ensure that this doesn't occur, but it's something which the government, which all its resources and its power should be doing with real vigour. Will he act to make sure that no workers are worse off as a result of government policy, as this motion demands? I invite him to tell the House how he'll do that.